The world was engulfed in chaos. The thunderous roar of artillery and the deafening blasts of bombs echoed across continents, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Cities lay in ruins, and the skies were darkened by the smoke of countless fires. The human cost was staggering, with millions of lives lost and countless more forever altered by the horrors of war. It was 1942, and the Second World War raged across the globe. From the deserts of North Africa to the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, battles were fought on every front. The world had never seen such a widespread and devastating conflict, with nations from every corner of the earth drawn into the fray. The stakes were high, and the future of humanity hung in the balance. The Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, were on the offensive. Their military might seem unstoppable, as they advanced with ruthless efficiency. The Nazis, under the command of Adolf Hitler, sought to establish a new world order based on their twisted ideology. Meanwhile, the Japanese Empire, driven by a desire for expansion and dominance, sought to control the vast resources of the Pacific. Their armies marched across Europe and Asia, seemingly unstoppable. German tanks rolled through the streets of conquered cities while Japanese infantry advanced through the dense jungles of Southeast Asia. The Axis powers were relentless in their pursuit of victory, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. The world watched in horror as one nation after another fell to their might. The United States, recently drawn into the conflict by the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, found itself struggling to respond to the aggression of its enemies. The attack had been a wake-up call, shattering the illusion of safety and forcing the nation to confront the harsh realities of war. American soldiers, many of them young and inexperienced, were thrust into the heart of the conflict, determined to defend their country and their way of life. The attack on Pearl Harbor, a devastating blow to American morale, left the nation reeling and eager for retribution. The images of burning ships and the loss of thousands of lives were seared into the collective memory of the American people. The call to arms was clear, and the nation rallied behind the war effort with a newfound sense of purpose and determination. The early months of the war were dark for the Allies. The Axis powers seemed to have the upper hand, and the situation looked bleak. Allied soldiers faced grueling conditions on the front lines, battling not only the enemy but also the harsh elements and the constant threat of death. Despite the odds, they fought with courage and resilience, determined to turn the tide of the war. Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific, capturing territory with alarming speed. Their naval and air superiority allowed them to strike with precision, overwhelming the defenses of their enemies. The rapid expansion of the Japanese Empire posed a significant threat to the Allies, who struggled to mount an effective response. The Philippines, Hong Kong, and Singapore fell in quick succession. Each loss was a blow to the Allied forces, who were forced to retreat and regroup. The fall of these strategic locations gave the Japanese control over key resources and territories, further strengthening their position in the Pacific. The American people were in shock. News of the rapid Japanese advances and the fall of key territories spread quickly, leaving the nation in a state of disbelief. Families gathered around radios and newspapers, anxiously awaiting updates on the war. The sense of urgency and the need for a decisive response grew with each passing day. They needed a sign of hope. The American war machine began to mobilize, with factories shifting production to war materials and soldiers undergoing rigorous training. The nation's industrial might was harnessed to support the war effort, and the spirit of unity and determination spread across the country. The American people were ready to do whatever it took to achieve victory. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been a serious blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The damage to the ships and infrastructure was extensive, and the loss of life was profound. However, the resilience and ingenuity of the American people shone through as efforts to repair and rebuild the fleet began in earnest. The determination to overcome this setback and strike back at the enemy was palpable. The U.S. military was still recovering. The process of rebuilding and rearming was a monumental task, requiring the coordination of resources and manpower on an unprecedented scale. Despite the challenges, the resolve of the American forces remained unshaken. They trained tirelessly, preparing for the battles that lay ahead. The situation seemed dire, and the American people desperately needed a reason to believe that victory was still possible. The war had tested the nation's resolve, but it had also brought out the best in its people. Acts of heroism and sacrifice were commonplace, and the spirit of patriotism burned brightly. The belief that freedom and justice would ultimately prevail kept hope alive, even in the darkest of times. In the wake of the Pearl Harbor attack, the United States was determined to strike back at Japan. The surprise assault on December 7, 1941, had left the nation in shock and mourning. Over 2,400 Americans lost their lives, and the Pacific Fleet suffered significant damage. This unprovoked attack galvanized the American public and government into action, igniting a fierce resolve to respond with equal force. The American people were outraged, and their leaders sought a way to retaliate and boost morale. Across the country, citizens gathered around radios, hung on every word of news reports, and read newspaper headlines with a mix of anger and determination. Public rallies and protests erupted, demanding justice and a strong response to the Japanese aggression. The collective sentiment was clear: America needed to demonstrate its strength and resolve. The U.S. military, however, faced a significant challenge. The Japanese Navy was powerful, and their home islands were heavily defended. The Pacific Ocean presented a vast and formidable barrier, making any direct assault on Japan a daunting task. Military strategists convened numerous meetings analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of the Japanese forces. They knew that any misstep could result in catastrophic losses. A direct assault on Japan seemed impossible at the time. The Japanese coastal defenses were robust, with well-fortified positions and vigilant soldiers ready to repel any invaders. The military installations were strategically placed to maximize their defensive capabilities, creating a nearly impenetrable shield around the Japanese home islands. The U.S. needed a plan that could bypass these formidable defenses and strike at the heart of Japan. It was in this context that the idea for a daring and unprecedented raid on the Japanese mainland was conceived. Military planners brainstormed various strategies, seeking a way to deliver a significant blow to the Japanese war effort without incurring unacceptable risks. The concept of a surprise air raid emerged as a potential solution, one that could catch the enemy off guard and deliver a powerful psychological impact. The mission, spearheaded by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, aimed to deliver a psychological blow to the enemy and prove that Japan was not invincible. Doolittle, a respected and innovative aviator, was chosen to lead this audacious operation. His leadership and expertise were crucial in planning and executing the raid, which would later be known as the Doolittle Raid. The mission's objectives were clear: to strike at the Japanese mainland, boost American morale, and sow doubt among the Japanese leadership about their invulnerability. The raid was a risky proposition. It would involve launching land-based bombers from an aircraft carrier, something that had never been done before. The B-25 Mitchell bombers, chosen for their range and payload capacity, had to be modified to take off from the short deck of an aircraft carrier. This unprecedented tactic required meticulous planning and coordination, as the bombers would have to launch from the USS Hornet, a carrier not designed for such operations. The planes would have to take off with a minimal amount of fuel, and the crews would face perilous conditions as they attempted to reach their targets and escape. The bombers were stripped of non-essential equipment to lighten their load, and additional fuel tanks were installed to extend their range. Despite these modifications, the crews knew that their chances of returning safely were slim. They would have to navigate enemy territory, evade anti-aircraft defenses, and find a way to land in friendly or neutral territory after completing their mission. Despite the risks, the potential rewards were considered worth the gamble. The Doolittle Raid represented a bold and innovative approach to warfare, one that could shift the momentum of the conflict in the Pacific. Success would not only damage Japanese infrastructure but also send a clear message that the United States was capable of striking back, no matter the odds. The mission's success would hinge on the bravery and skill of the men involved, and their willingness to undertake one of the most daring operations of the war. The planning for what would become known as the Doolittle Raid was shrouded in secrecy. The mission's success depended on complete surprise, so every precaution was taken to keep the operation under wraps. Doolittle and his team faced numerous challenges. They had to find a way to launch B-25 bombers, typically land-based aircraft, from the relatively short deck of an aircraft carrier. They also needed to train volunteer crews for the dangerous mission and equip them with the necessary skills and equipment. The B-25 Mitchell bomber, known for its versatility and range, was chosen for the mission. Modifications were made to the aircraft to optimize their performance for the unique demands of the raid. Extra fuel tanks were installed to extend their range, and the planes were stripped of unnecessary weight. The crews selected for the Doolittle Raid were all volunteers, fully aware of the dangers they faced. They underwent rigorous training at Eglin Field in Florida, practicing short takeoffs and low-altitude flying. The men spent hours honing their skills, knowing that their lives depended on their ability to execute the mission flawlessly. The training was intense and demanding. The crews practiced bombing runs, navigation, and survival techniques. They simulated carrier takeoffs from a painted runway on land, pushing themselves and their aircraft to the limit. Every detail of the mission, from takeoff to landing, was meticulously planned and rehearsed. The crews were not told their target until the very last moment. They knew only that they were embarking on an extremely hazardous mission against the enemy. Despite the risks, their morale was high, fueled by a sense of patriotism and a desire to avenge Pearl Harbor. On April 18, 1942, the USS Hornet, carrying the 16 B-25 bombers of the Doolittle Raid, steamed towards its rendezvous point in the Western Pacific. The mission was a daring one, conceived in the wake of the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. The goal was to strike back at the heart of Japan, to show that the enemy was not invincible, and to boost American morale. The atmosphere on board was tense with anticipation, as the crews made final preparations for their mission. Pilots and crew members went over their checklists, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. The weight of their task was heavy on their shoulders, knowing that they were about to embark on a mission that could change the course of the war. The stakes were high, and the outcome of the raid was uncertain. Success would mean a significant psychological blow to the Japanese, but failure could result in the loss of valuable aircraft and personnel. The men knew the risks, but they were determined to carry out their orders. The launch was scheduled to take place hundreds of miles from the Japanese coast in a carefully planned operation. The timing was crucial, as the bombers needed to have enough fuel to reach their targets and then continue on to friendly territory in China. But the Hornet was spotted by a Japanese patrol boat. The sighting was a critical moment, as it threatened to compromise the entire mission. The element of surprise was lost, and the crew had to act quickly to avoid detection and potential attack. The discovery forced Doolittle to make a critical decision: launch the bombers immediately, even though they were still too far from their target. It was a gamble, but one that Doolittle was willing to take. He knew that delaying the launch could result in disaster. With a roar of engines and a rush of wind, the B-25s lumbered down the Hornet's short flight deck and into the air, one after another. The sight was both awe-inspiring and nerve-wracking, as the bombers struggled to gain altitude and head towards their distant targets. The roar of the engines was deafening, a testament to the power and determination of the crews. Each bomber carried a payload of bombs, ready to be dropped on strategic targets in Japan. The mission was underway, and there was no turning back. The B-25s lumbered down the Hornet's short flight deck and into the air, one after another. The sight of the land-based bombers taking flight from a carrier was a testament to the audacity of the mission and the skill of the crews. It was a moment of triumph and a symbol of hope for a nation at war. The sight of the land-based bombers taking flight from a carrier was a testament to the audacity of the mission and the skill of the crews. As the bombers disappeared into the horizon, the men on the Hornet could only hope that their comrades would succeed and return safely. The Doolittle Raid would go down in history as a bold and daring operation, a shining example of courage and ingenuity in the face of adversity. The B-25s, flying low to avoid detection, made their way towards their targets: Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. The crews faced heavy anti-aircraft fire as they approached their objectives, but they pressed on with unwavering determination. The bombs found their marks, striking military and industrial targets in the heart of Japan. The damage inflicted was relatively minor, but the psychological impact was significant. The raid demonstrated that Japan was vulnerable to attack, shaking the confidence of the Japanese people and their leaders. After dropping their bombs, the B-25s continued westward, hoping to reach friendly airfields in China. Fuel was running low, and the crews knew that their chances of survival were diminishing with every passing moment. They faced a perilous journey over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean.